Good morning, guys. Let's keep going now with our unit on immunity. In the last little section, we talked about some of the innate immune responses. So let's move in now to our active adaptive immune response. What we're going to talk about in this video is our helper T cells, which you can see in the middle row right here. So these are going to be the ones that are going to stimulate both the humoral and the cell-mediated immune response. And then for this video, we'll just talk about the cell-mediated immune response. So let's just keep going. Okay, when we're talking about cell-mediated immunity, we're talking about how our body deals with cells that have become infected with a foreign invader, an antigen. This could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, but we're talking about how our body deals with cells that are affected by this pathogen. So we have our foreign invader or antigen enters the body's cell. Our cells will present that antigen, so it will show the immune system that, hey, look, I've been invaded by something. Something isn't right. Once it does that, we call that cell, the cell that's showing off the antigen, we call that an antigen presenting cell. And a lot of times you'll see it abbreviated APC, antigen presenting cell. Now, these APCs are going to move around. They're going to find their way into lymphatic vessels, so on, and they're going to cause the activation of our T cells, which are the cells that are in charge of our cell-mediated immunity. And then hopefully these T cells will be able to eliminate this foreign invader. Okay, so let's have a look at these antigen-presenting cells. We've got three major types. If you think back to our innate immune response, we talked about macrophages. So these cells would go along and clean up anything that they found that they didn't recognize as the body or themselves. So that's one of our types of antigen presenting cells. And we also have these dendritic cells and the B cells. Now the function for these three cells are going to be quite similar. They're going to go around the body and they're going to engulf or trap or eat all these foreign antigens, all these things that shouldn't be in our body. What they're going to do then is they're going to use a protein complex that we call a major histocompatibility complex, and you'll often see it abbreviated as MHC, major histocompatibility complexes. So these MHCs will develop on the surface of these antigen presenting cells, and these MHCs will show what the antigen looks like. So if we look on the pictures up here, you can see we've got our dendritic cell, we've got our macrophage here, and we've got our B cell. So these are the three types of antigen presenting cells. And then they travel to lymph nodes, they travel to through blood vessels, and they show these antigens to these other parts of our immune system, mostly our T helper cells. And then once our T helper cells are activated, they go on to have a much bigger role to play in helping us out. So have a look at this little animation. It won't start for me right now, but you'll be able to see it on your notes. And now once we get past the antigen presenting cells, so don't forget those guys, they're very, very important, like our first point of contact. After we get past the antigen presenting cells, we end up activating our T cells. Now we've got three types of T cells. We've got helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, and memory T cells. Now the first thing that's going to happen is when a T cell comes in contact with an APC, it's going to clone itself. So you'll see here we've got our T cell, and it comes in contact with a virus infected cell. Now from there it clones itself and it starts to make copies. So here are all of our clones of that T cell which has come in contact with the virus. Now from this process right here, we're going to have differentiation. So these red arrows represent a process called clonal selection. And what that means is we're going to select for the type of cells that we're going to need at the time. So these T cell clones can turn into killer T cells, and these are the ones that are going to kill infected cells. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They can turn into helper T cells, which are very, very important. These will further activate the immune system. They'll activate killer T cells. They'll also produce B cells to start producing antibodies. They can become memory T cells. These are the type of cells they stay around after we're better. And if we see that infection again, it'll help us get rid of that infection much, much quicker. And finally, they could turn into suppressor T cells, which will help turn off the immune system so that we don't destroy too much. We only get rid of the virus or the pathogen that we're trying to get rid of. So these it's important for you guys to know these different types of cells and know what their functions are. So here they are again. We've got our antigen here. So we call it an antigen challenge, is when a cell is presented with an antigen. So here we have our immature T cell comes in contact with the antigen. It presents that antigen to becomes an antigen presenting cell, and then it can clone itself. From there, we can have this clonal specialization or clonal selection, and then this immature T cell can turn into a helper T cell, a cytotoxic T cell, or a memory T cell. So like the same thing we said on the previous slide. Now helper T cells are quite important. What's going to happen, we have our antigen presenting cells, so our APCs. They've come across an antigen, they've decided it's not part of us, so they present it on the surface of their cell using those MHCs that we talked about earlier. Now those macrophages, those APCs, they're going to stimulate, or they're going to produce a compound called interleukin-1, and that's sometimes abbreviated IL-1. If a helper T cell comes in contact with interleukin-1, it produces interleukin-2. Now both of these compounds are called cytokines, and a cytokine is a chemical messenger, so it's a small protein hormone that control the functions of other immune cells. So interleukin-2, that's going to be released from our T helper cell, is going to stimulate the production of cytotoxic T cells and B cells. Now cytotoxic T cells, they're going to be the main fighters in our cell-mediated immunity. And B cells, they're going to be in charge of our humoral or antibody-mediated immunity. We're going to talk about that more in a later video. So down here, we've got our antigen presenting cell. So here's our antigen presenting cell right here. Here's the MHC on its surface showing the antigen, and that comes in contact with a T helper cell. So what T helper cell will the antigen presenting cell will release interleukin-1, which will cause that T helper cell to release interleukin-2. Interleukin-2 is going to turn on the cytotoxic T cells, so TC down here, and it's also going to turn on our B cells. Now this is going to bring us down the cell-mediated immunity pathway, and this one's going to bring us down our humoral immunity pathway. Cell-mediated is going to be dealing with cells that are infected. Humoral immunity is going to be dealing with infections or antigens that aren't inside cells yet, so they're in our body fluids or in somewhere else in our tissues. So here's another version of what we were just talking about. We have our T helper cell. It's come in contact with an antigen presenting cell up here. So we get an APC. The cells start to clone, and then from those clonal cells they can turn into several different things. We talked about activating killer T cells, turning on the B cells, increasing the macrophages. So this kind of brings us back to our innate immune system. And then you can have these other ones here that will suppress the immune system or slow the immune response down so that it doesn't get too out of hand. So we talked about helper T cells. The next type of T cell are the cytotoxic T cells, and you'll see that they're often written several different ways. Generally, if you see a T and a C next to each other, we're talking about a cytotoxic T cell. These cells will recognize cells that have been invaded by microbes such as bacteria and viruses. They'll also represent or recognize tumor cells, so cancer, and they'll also recognize transplanted tissues. So if you had a tissue transplant, remember, those aren't cells that were normally in your body. So our immune system could see those as an enemy and something to attack. So the diagrams down here are pretty cool, showing how a cytotoxic T cell would attack a cell. Here's our cytotoxic T cell down here, and that's going to find an infected cell. So there it is, presenting the antibody. It binds, and then from the cytotoxic T cell, it releases these compounds called perforins, and these perforins go and attack the infected cell, and they make pores, little tiny holes all over the surface of the cell. And you can see up here, once those perforins make these holes, then the cell contents spill out, and as a result of that, the cells will die. If the cells die, then we also kill the pathogen in the process. So that's how a cytotoxic T cell generally works. Again, this picture is showing you the same type of thing we just talked about before. Another way to look at it, you can see all the key points are labeled on this slide, so maybe it's a little bit more detailed than the one before. Cytolytic, and it's broken down here. Cyto, of course, means cell, and lytic, or means lysis, to burst. So a cytotoxic T cell will burst infected cells. So here's a look, an overall look at the cell-mediated immune response. We have our antigen presenting cell here. So it has ingested an antigen, and then it shows it using its major histocompatibility complex, the MHC. And that MHC is recognized by a T helper cell. The T helper cell goes through a bunch of cloning, so it starts to produce a whole different pile of new cells. And then those cells can be turned into different functioning cells. We have our killer T cell, or a cytotoxic T cell, and that's going to deal with our cellular immunity. We have the B cells, which are going to deal with the humoral immunity, and we'll talk about that in the next video. We can also have the helper T cells increasing the non-specific defenses, so macrophages, neutrophils, other lymphocytes. And then finally, the last type of cells that they can produce are the memory T cells, and that's what we'll talk about on the next slide. So our memory T cells are quite important. They do a wonderful thing in that they protect us in the long run. After we've been sick, after we fought an infection, we have these memory T cells that stick around in our bloodstream. Okay, so they stay put, and they have those recognition sites for that pathogen. So if we encounter another pathogen, the same pathogen we've encountered before, we've got thousands of these memory T cells that are present already, and then we don't need to go through that clonal selection anymore. Those memory T cells will just differentiate into cytotoxic T cells or helper T cells, and then they'll immediately get to work on destroying that invader. So we don't need to go through all these steps again. We kind of skip those steps and then move right into fighting the infection. Okay, so that's a look at our cell-mediated immunity. So far we've covered cell-mediated, we've talked about helper T cells, and now we're going to move into the next video, which is going to show us our humoral immunity.